I'm Julia Lupton, and I am representing both the UCI Authors Program, which is part of Illuminations, and the UC Humanities Research Institute, which is launching the first of 3 book talks featuring UC authors talking about refugees and forced migration. And I'm really excited to feature today's book, Suffer the Little Children, which is a broad, brilliant, and moving study of child migrants to the United States. Our wonderful author, Anita Casavantes Bradford, full professor of Chicano Latino Studies and History here at UC Irvine. Anita will be interviewed this evening by another UCI author, Dr. Hector Tobar. Hector is professor of Chicano Latino Studies and English here at UC Irvine. He is the author of many books, including The Barbarian Nurseries, The Last Great Road Bum, Translation Nation, and The Tattooed Soldier. So I'm really thrilled that Anita and Hector agreed to join us to launch our series on refugee studies across the UC system with a glimpse into this very moving and powerful book. So welcome, Hector and Anita.
Anita, it was such a pleasure to read your book. Well, pleasure actually isn't quite the right word. Maybe it was illuminating to travel through these decades and decades of our country's policy towards child immigration, unaccompanied child immigration especially, and through all of these different dramas and soap operas, each one, with its own sort of particular characteristics. But my first question, I'm just wondering is, tell us what motivated you to write this book, and how it became this all-encompassing project, this expansive survey that it became.
Yeah, well, hi, Hector. Nice to see you. Thank you, Julia, and thanks to UCI Illuminations for giving me this chance to talk about my book. How did I end up writing it? So this book really was motivated both by scholarly as well as more sort of personal or maybe activist. In my first book, I wrote about the politics of childhood in the Cuban Revolution and in the formation of the Miami exile community, and explored how important the figure of the child is to the way that nations or different communities create political projects and how they justify and advance their politics through claims that what they're doing is in the best interests of children, right? While I was doing that study, I learned about the Cuban Children Program, otherwise known as Operation Pedro Pan, which brought 14,000 unaccompanied Cuban children to the US in between 1960 and 1963, following the Cuban Revolution. So this particular moment in history is seen amongst Cuban Americans as sort of an exceptional moment, right? For some, a moment of American humanitarianism. For others, a very different story, right? But it's seen as an exceptional, and so that's sort of background to the moment in 2015 when, as a professor of history of immigration and the faculty advisor for UCI's Dreams at UCI, to student community, at this moment in 2015 when the latest surge of unaccompanied Central American minors began entering the US and set off a political and a moral panic across the country. And my students and students in Dreams at UCI came to me and asked me, what's going on here? Why are these children coming? Why are they being demonized? Why are they being deported? And I felt sort of a scholarly responsibility to provide them with an answer, both as a historian of immigration and as someone who had written about Cuban children who had been treated very differently in the 60s to explain as a historian why one group of children was accepted and this other group was not, but then also as a sort of as a human being, as a person, as an advocate for a group of undocumented students, many of whom were taking the treatment of Central American unaccompanied minors very to heart. I felt a personal obligation to be able to provide them with a real answer to their questions. But the book didn't exist, right?
Mhm.
There have been a lot of really good and really thoughtful sociological and anthropological and legal studies of recent unaccompanied migrant children, right? But they're very present focused. And they're also, they tend to be sort of micro stories where they follow a child or a small group of children through the system. And so that those kind of stories left unanswered the questions that my students were asking, like, how did we get to this point? Why are these kids coming, right? And why were some admitted in the past and these children are demonized and deported, right? So I thought, in my sort of very naive early associate professor mindset, that how hard could it be to write the history of unaccompanied child migration to the US? Thankfully, I was naive enough to take on the project, which turned out to be really challenging. But yeah, I guess that's how it started.
Well, yes, I feel the urgency of the book, right? Because we're talking about one of the defining crises of our time, right? We're talking about this drama, this spectacle, this tragedy that's taking place on the border, the use of, immigrant families as, props in political arguments, et cetera, et cetera. But what's amazing what's amazing in your book is that you draw the pictures of all these different crises in history against the backdrop of the needs of how U.S. immigration policy has been formed and the political needs of the different moments. And so when we go back to the very first one in your book, which is, the 1930s crises that in the revolution and civil war in Spain, the early years of Nazism, and the movement of several Jewish organizations to bring refugees over. All of that takes place against the backdrop of a then recently adopted, very important immigration law, the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act, which established these quotas, right? That was the first major law that sort of used immigration as a tool of racial engineering, right? It established quotas for, Swedes and Italians, Germans and whatnot. So can you talk a little bit about what you learned there about these early policies towards child minors, refugees and U.S. racial policy?
Yeah, so this is, it's tremendously intricate, and I'm still sort of, even though I've written the book and it's published, I'm still working through a lot of this in my own brain, right? So the 1930s is a really interesting moment in terms of immigration policy, specifically when we look at it in light of unaccompanied child migrants, because a lot of things are kind of bumping up against each other, right? We have the Johnson-Reed Act, which established racialized national origins quotas on how many people could immigrate to the US from each country based on the sort of perceived racial desirability of each nation, right? We have that. We have also changing ideas about children and who's a child and who's a worker that really begin to shift in the 1930s in relation to the Depression. So that also impacts immigration. And then, of course, we have the rise of fascism in Europe and the US trying to stay out of that, right? The US was isolationist, didn't want to be in World War II, ended up there later, right? These three things kind of work together to create the context for the migration of the first state-recognized unaccompanied migrants to the US who were European Jewish children, right? But I want to sort of asterisk that for a moment and say that unaccompanied child migrants have been coming to the US since before the US was the US. During the colonial period, the first unaccompanied minors to come to the US were African slaves, minor children who were, of course, not seen as children or as migrants. They were chattel, they were property, right? But they were, needless to say, also unaccompanied minor children, right? The reason the book starts in the 30s is because this is when the US government first begins to recognize children and unaccompanied migrant children as a unique category, right? So in the early 30s, after Hitler takes power in Germany, as German Jewish families began looking for ways to migrate to the US, many of them found that although there was room in the German quota for them to come to the United States, a combination of policies, administrative policies, not laws, administrative policies put into place to limit immigration to the US during the Depression, as well as deliberate efforts by anti-Semitic consular officers and State Department officials, created a situation in which, even though visas were available, German Jews couldn't get them, right? Other than a very few elite artists, scientists, etc. But your average German Jewish family couldn't get visas to come to the US. So as conditions began worsening in Germany, families that originally were determined to emigrate together began seeing the violence in Germany increasing and any hope that they had of immigrating as families decreasing, and so began to consider for the first time sending just their children to the US in the hopes that they might themselves be able to find a way out later. With that sort of desire in place, American Jewish social workers, immigrant activists, lawyers, etc., got together and created an organization, the German Jewish Children's Aid, which petitioned the federal government for basically permission to bring a small group of children as on temporary visas to be fostered by Jewish American families. Where was I going with this? Right, the obstacles that they encountered. Although, again, there were quota numbers available, the main sort of administrative burden, barrier to them coming to the US was a clause, an administrative clause that was put in place in 1930, the LPC clause, the liable to become a public charge clause, right? And this was basically an administrative policy that immigration officials could deny entry to the country to people who were otherwise eligible, but who appeared likely to draw upon public services or need quote unquote charity or welfare in some form. Before the 1930s, this clause existed, but it was interpreted very loosely. If someone was healthy and presumed able to work, that was enough to tick that box. Beginning in the 1930s, this LPC clause was increasingly weaponized, and it was weaponized against Jewish Europeans to prevent their entry. And basically it was interpreted as anyone who didn't bring substantial wealth with them or possess a high-skilled elite technical occupation was designated as likely to become a public charge and therefore barred from immigrating, right? So, you know, this very restrictive immigration climate, which was further racialized against Jewish people, then was complicated by the fact that as of 1917, minors were no longer allowed to immigrate on their own without a special waiver from the Bureau of Labor. Before 1917, decisions about who could enter the country in terms of age was sort of left to the discretion of the immigration official, right? And so a healthy 14-year-old boy who looked like he might be a good worker would usually be paroled or admitted to the country. Not so for women. Young women were often barred from entering. They weren't seen to be necessarily at an age where they could work in wholesome ways, right? But after 1917, this was made sort of a rigid no underage minors are allowed, right? So this was sort of the racial and the administrative immigration climate and the sort of age-based restrictionist climate that the first efforts to bring children to the US took place in.
Well, it's really interesting to me reading this account, how there are so many similarities, to other, especially these first, cases. I mean, these cases of 1930s and 40s. The Jewish organizations that are trying to work to bring these children are very, very aware of how powerful anti-Semitism is. And at some point, they try to go under the radar. They don't, they try not to attract too much attention to the program because they're afraid of this anti-Semitic backlash. And then the people trying to bring the Basque refugees from the Spanish Civil War, they confront this powerful anti-communism, in the sense that bringing these children is support for this, leftist government. And then moving forward, not too much further into history, we have, World War II breaks out. The United States, becomes an ally of Britain. And there is this incredible sympathy for British children. And there's all this language that's very coded racial language about the desirability of British children versus others. Can you talk a little bit about how those elements are playing out in that period of history?
Yeah, so within kind of a 5-year period, there's 3 different groups of children that different groups of Americans advocate for bringing to the US. And each of them is handled very differently, right? German Jewish children from 1934 through about 1942, small numbers were in fact admitted, but they were admitted, I would say, despite the efforts of the federal government to largely prevent them from being admitted, and due to the persistence and expertise and ingenuity of American Jewish leaders who found loopholes and pressed for, exceptions and brought a few hundred children to the US, saving most of them from certain death in the Holocaust, right? At the same time, in 1937, at the height of the Spanish Civil War, following the bombing of Guernica, anti-fascist Americans attempted to bring Basque refugee children to the US, and their effort was a spectacular failure for a number of reasons. And, some of those reasons had to do with the fact that they themselves had no plan. Right. They were operating out of sort of political solidarity and emotion, and just had no plan. It's interesting that even though they were operating in the same time period as the German Jewish Children's Aid that was successfully bringing small groups of children to the US from fascist Germany, there was no connection between these groups, right? The Basque advocates didn't reach out to these other folks. But the big reason that effort failed was due to primarily to local anti-communism and to the power of Boston Irish anti-communists and their position within the federal government, right? And so what's interesting there is that, and I argue this throughout the book, that in each of the cases where children were admitted or denied, it was never just about one thing. It was never just about race. It was never just about foreign policy. It was never just about the domestic conditions, right? It was always about a really complicated, specific, in the moment convergence of foreign policy and domestic political contexts, as well as sort of the racial politics that run through immigration, right? We see this clearly in the third group of children that people advocated to bring in this time period, the end of the 30s, beginning of 1940s, British children, right? Who, following the beginnings of the German air war on Britain, the British government, as probably some of our audience knows, began evacuating English children from London and from the cities into the countryside to protect them from the bombing, right? There was also a pretty controversial in Britain at the time. There was also a program to evacuate children from Britain to Commonwealth countries, Canada, Australia, etc. Well, there were a number of Americans who were frustrated at this point by the US's refusal to enter the Second World War, right? So we're in 1940 now, and the US is explicitly remaining isolationist. And although it's finding little ways, Roosevelt is finding ways of getting some aid over to Britain. There's no explicit involvement in the war just yet. And Americans who were frustrated by this attached to the idea of, well, how about if we help these British children? Let's bring some of these noble young British children to the US, right? And very much seeing at the evacuation of children to the US as a way of demonstrating their political solidarity for British parents engaged in World War II. When those folks, advocates for bringing British children to the US, went to the American government, the response that they received was night and day compared to the response that American Jewish leaders received when they quietly went to the US government and asked for some assistance, permission to bring German Jewish children to the US. The US government not only said absolutely yes, but went out of their way to waive existing requirements in immigration law, to categorize the British children as tourists, thereby facilitating their immediate entry to the US, despite the fact that they had used the argument that German Jewish children could not be admitted as tourists because in a wartime there was no guarantee that they could return home.
Right.
The same, of course, applied to British children, but that was disregarded, right? So there was active support on the part of the federal government who saw facilitating the bringing of British children to the US as a cheap and easy way of appearing to be providing support to the British war effort without actually providing any, they weren't funding the program. All of the funds for these programs were privately raised at this time. But it was, it was a way for the government to get a good foreign policy outcome out of something that would be privately organized. And the American public also had an entirely different sort of response to the idea of bringing children. Whereas the American Jewish leaders that had advocated for bringing children to the US had, as Hector had mentioned, they really tried to keep it under wraps that they were going to bring German Jewish children to the US because they were so terrified of creating a backlash that would then hurt the Jewish community even further. In the case of those who were advocating to bring British children, it was widely publicized and it was embraced enthusiastically by the American public. One wrinkle, though, that I want to add to this, because it seems like we're telling a very black and white story here, right? It's important to note that the same people who were advocating for bringing European Jewish children to the US, many of whom were American Jewish leaders, but not all of them. Some of them were Catholic and Protestant and secular American humanitarians. Those same folks, when 1940 happened and when they saw the American response, sympathy for British children, those were the same who reorganized and created what was the United States Committee for the Care of European Children, the organization that would basically oversee bringing British children to the US. It was the same people that did kind of a strategic about face and went, okay, we're getting the door blocked when we try to bring European Jewish children, but now there's all this interest in bringing British children. How about if we jump on that wagon, but in the process, advocate for their admission in ways that creates loopholes that'll also allow us to keep slipping Jewish children in. And that's precisely what they did, right? And so in the book, I talk about the principled opportunism of these leaders who, while sort of reading the environment in terms of the racial politics of the time, knew that they weren't going to get public support to save Jewish children. but figured they could get some public support for bringing white Christian British children to the US, but also find ways to use that kind of effervescence to save more Jewish children's lives.
Yeah, I think that that's just that's a constant in the history of immigrant and refugee movements, is creativity, improvisation, finding ways to get around the restrictions. Now, one thing that really struck me is how much of this ends up being a media drama, a media drama across all the history of US media, right, from the 1930s to the present. And so, for example, 1956, the Hungarian refugee crisis set off by the failed democratic rebellion against the Soviet dominated government in Hungary. There's this incredible rush to let in Hungarian children. 800 are let in, and then suddenly, just as quickly, there's this rush to close the door. Why does that happen, do you think?
Yeah, why does that happen, and why does it continue happening, right? Why
Right.
were we interested in Afghan refugees for a minute after the US's recent withdrawal from Afghanistan? And then, now we're not talking about the fact that there are displaced people of all ages. I guess people are fickle, right? Not just Americans. But I think a large part of it has to do with the way that government leaders as well as humanitarian leaders tend to frame refugee issues and child refugee issues, right? We tend to frame questions of displacement and our responsibility towards displaced people in kind of a humanitarian language. And the media and the government and advocates strategically use language that they hope will inspire sympathy and provoke kind of an emotional response that will get people to open their hearts and open the doors of the country, right? Sympathy and effervescence only lasts so long, and people get compassion fatigue, right?
Absolutely.
So, as long as we've had a refugee policy, we have had a tendency to frame our decisions about refugees in this kind of humanitarian language and in a language of sympathy and charity, rather than in sort of a real rigorous and thoughtful conversation about refugee rights and about children's rights. Those are big questions. Also, sympathy is easy. Sympathy can be extended and then it can be withdrawn when it's too quickly. Conversations about rights, once you declare it, there's sort of an obligation to live up to fulfilling that right. But yeah, I guess I think that's what goes on. I see this today in efforts to advocate for unaccompanied minors being admitted to the US, when advocates tend to focus on images of very young children and to frame them as victims in order to get people to be sympathetic towards them and to admit them to the country based on sympathy, right? Despite the fact that we know that the overwhelming majority of unaccompanied minors that are coming to the US today are over the age of 14. Most of them over the age of 16. And many of them back home, whether it's in Central America or the Caribbean or elsewhere, would be bewildered to be called children, right? Many of them have been economically productive, politically active for some time, right? This is where sort of our work as historians or scholars and then our activist commitments kind of bump into each other, right? Where on the one hand, we understand that advocates know that sympathy is important and the figure of the child is a sympathetic figure, right? And so framing unaccompanied minors as children to get sympathy to facilitate their entry has short-term value. It might have some long-term negatives, however, in that it keeps us from having real conversations about whether or not these young people have a right to be admitted to the country and whether it goes beyond them being helpless and cute, right?
Well, speaking of sympathy, you have this to me, it was a very interesting and provocative statement in your introduction that one of the uses of policy towards unaccompanied minors or towards refugees in general is that it allows policymakers to make an argument or to stage a drama that confirms the superiority of the American way of life. And when I think about that, I think about what happened with the Cuban Revolution and the phenomenon of thousands of unaccompanied Cuban children coming to the United States. I was stunned at the number 14,000. I mean, after just allowing 800 Hungarian refugees, suddenly we have 14,000. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, about how the Cuban exodus fit into this, these ideological imperatives of refugee policy.
Yeah, I mean, so this is tricky too, right?
Mhm.
Much of what's been written about the Cuban Children's Program before my chapter in this book, including some of the stuff that I wrote, really imagined this program as very intentional.
Mm.
And so the argument has been about what was the intention, right? Was it humanitarian, as supporters of the program tend to argue, or was it a sinister CIA-supported plot to destroy Cuban families, as
Wow.
the revolution supporters argue, right?
Wow.
What I discovered in the time that I spent in the archives for this last book was that this program is as much an accident as it was intentional, right? The original sort of idea for the program, which was brought to folks in the State Department, in the federal government, was to create a very small program, a temporary short-term program to provide safekeeping of the children of anti-Castro activists, members of the underground, to protect their children so that they could freely engage in counter-revolutionary activities, right? It then was extended slightly to allow just some other children of elite families whose parents and people in the US wanted to safeguard them as future democratic elite leaders of the Cuban government, protect them from ideological sort of from brainwashing, right, in communist Cuba. But we're still talking about hundreds, maybe a couple of thousands of children, right? What really makes this program blow up and what leads to 14,000 children coming to the US is that up until the winter of 1961, adult Cubans were able to enter the US without any paperwork, right? They could literally just show up at the US, in the US, and they'd be admitted, whether they had a visa waiver, no visa, nothing, they would be admitted, right? In fact, the INS office in Miami acknowledges, and I've got this in archival documents, that, we're admitting people that have no papers and that have no visas, and we're fully aware that they're working, but that's only decent and humane because they've got to support their families, right? And this was known all the way up to the federal government. So basically entering documented or undocumented up until the winter of 61, you could come as an adult. So you could bring your kids with you, right? As of the winter of 1961, a number of things happened, right? The embassy closes, the ability to get visa waivers as adults kind of closed down. A number of things happened that made it impossible for other than a few Cuban adults, unless they already had family in the US, to get papers to come to the US. But kids could get papers through this program, through the Operation Pedro Pan. There were visa waivers available for children, and they were being smuggled to the island through this network. So all of a sudden, getting a US where that child could then go and petition from the US for visa waivers for parents to leave Cuba became one of the only ways for Cubans to legally leave Cuba, right? So it started what became a really complicated out-migration that was, yes, in part provoked by some parents wanting their children to be not exposed to communist indoctrination. It was also motivated by some families that wanted to go as a family but couldn't, and so sent one child who could then advocate for them to come. And then also it was motivated by the language by which the program was discussed in Cuba. Foster care, federally funded foster care, as we understand it, wasn't something that existed in Cuba at the time. And so people who talked about the program on the island referred to the program as a program de becas, of scholarships for Cuban children to go to school in the US, right? And be cared for by American families. Now, there's a long history of elite Cuban families sending their children to the US to boarding school. And so this fit into the mindsets of lots of middle class and upper middle class people. So that also became an element, that things are uncertain in Cuba right now. We're probably not supporters of the revolution, but there's also a chance for our kid to have a scholarship in the US, right? All of this combined with the fact that suddenly after Winter 61, parents couldn't get visas, made the program explode. That was never what anyone had in mind, right?
Wow.
And the people in Florida who were running the program, the people in the federal government who were being asked to authorize increasing amounts of money for federal foster care for these children, were freaking out, right? They were like, no, this isn't what we had in mind, but we can't backtrack now because, well, these kids are kind of useful in terms of propaganda because they show that, you know, good God-fearing Cuban families don't want their children on the island anymore. So, you know, they have some value to us, but also we can't go back on our commitment to the anti-communist underground in Cuba, right? So it's really as much of an accident, like many things. I mean, political scientists will tell us this, right? That unintended consequences play a huge role in state formation. The Cuban Children's Program is as much an unintended consequence as it was intentional.
Wow. I mean, I think that's one of the joys of reading a history like yours that is so careful with the details and the facts, is that you do see these how the different actors sometimes act against each other's interests and et cetera. Now I'm going to ask I'm going to ask one more question here, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. And I would like to encourage anyone in the audience to type in a question here in the Q&A function here on Zoom. But my question is kind of it's a three-part thing, because these three things to me seem to go together, and that's the story of the Vietnamese exodus, which of course is a little bit like an Asian version of Cuba, because it involves people fleeing this communist revolution. And then the response to that, which is the Refugee Act of 1980, which aims to bring some sort of order and jurisprudence to this phenomenon of mass migration. And then finally, how all that, the 1980 Refugee Act, how does that affect, if at all, the current child migration crisis that we're seeing? So that's my question. I know it's a big one, but I wanted to sort of summarize those three things. Yeah.
Right. And bring us up to the present moment.
Yeah.
There are some folks in the audience that are interested in more recent history, right?
Yes.
Okay. Right. So the Cuban program really goes on until after the beginning of the freedom flights in 1965, which brought some of those Cuban parents who couldn't get to the U.S. To the U.S. between 1965 and the early 1970s. So most of the Cuban children who had been in federally funded foster care are returned to their families. Not all of them. Some of them stayed in federal foster care until they aged out and were never reunited with their families. But this program that had been intended to be for a few hundred children for a few months eventually went on for the greater part of 2 decades. And served thousands of children and cost, tens of millions of dollars. By the time the program was finally closed, congressional leaders were really tired of paying for it. And this now is overlapping with the Vietnam War era, right? So when the Vietnam War comes to an end and the US begins admitting Vietnamese refugees, who they admitted for several years as parolees, not as refugees, They also discovered amongst those who were admitted by accident that there were unaccompanied minors, right? Some who came intentionally, some whose parents or relatives were separated from them or in the journey, right? Despite the fact that we're now in the 70s and for 40 years we've been receiving unaccompanied minors, there's still no thought put by the federal government into the likelihood that there's probably going to be some unaccompanied minors. So discovering unaccompanied Southeast Asian minors again was kind of a surprise and a panic and an improv effort to care for these children. Similarly, Vietnamese refugees themselves were imagined by the federal government as being a small group who would be evacuated immediately following the end of the war, and that they would be limited in number. That is not, in fact, what ended up happening, right? Exoduses from Vietnam and from Southeast Asia continued throughout the 70s, and we continued to respond to them in improvisational and sort of half-assed ways. The combination of the sort of compassion fatigue born of the Cuban Children's Program and the frustration of congressional and executive leaders with our ongoing need to improvise ways of admitting refugees to the US, because we didn't have a law that allowed us to admit refugees in any sort of orderly way. These two sort of pressures worked together and drove Congress to finally pass in 1980 the Refugee Act, which was the United States' first dedicated, comprehensive, permanent refugee legislation. We didn't have a refugee law until 1980. Everyone who was admitted before that was admitted on a case-by-case kind of exceptional basis, right? So yay, hooray, we finally got a refugee law, which is framed in humanitarian language, but also gives the president and Congress the ability to set on a yearly basis the priorities for where we're going to admit people from. Again, based on our foreign policy priorities primarily, right? Right when this Refugee Act is passed, something else happens literally 2 months later. Mariel exodus, and a third wave of unregulated and unpre-authorized Cuban immigrants arrives in the US. And this wave of Cuban immigrants, most of them working class, many of them mixed race or Afro-Cubans, did not receive the same kind of sympathy that earlier waves of middle class and elite white Cubans received. There was a huge public backlash against them. There was an even bigger public backlash against the Haitian refugees who began entering at the same time. Add to this the fact that revolutions in Central America, which were being exacerbated by US interventions in the region, were also beginning to produce outmigrations and asylum seekers from Central America. These things intertwined with one another to create a massive anti-refugee moment in the US, ironically at the very moment that the Refugee Act was passed, right? How does this then create the conditions for the moment that we're in? So in terms of children, the Refugee Act of 1980 also created the first permanent federally funded program for the reception of unaccompanied refugee minors, rather than just, again, dealing with them each wave as a surprise and improvising a program for them. The Unaccompanied Refugee Minors Program, which has been in place since then, on a yearly basis now admits refugee minors, places them in foster homes, provides them with medical care, education, etc. It's a reasonably good program. It cares for a very small number of children, however, and they're children that are already living, usually in refugee camps overseas, or that have been designated by the United Nations as refugees. What's the issue here? We go back to the moment in 1980 when we passed a Refugee Act that had no provision in it for processing refugees arriving in the US as a country of first asylum, meaning people who show up at the border without pre-authorization, which is what refugees do everywhere else in the world. They flee across a border, right? Now, because the US is isolated geographically and for a number of other reasons, we, until the 1980s, had never really dealt with a group of first asylum seeking refugees, right? other than Cubans in the 60s, but we didn't really see them that way, right? All of a sudden in 1980, we've got Haitians, Cubans, and Central Americans all seeking asylum in an unregulated, disorderly way, which is what refugees do. And our law doesn't provide for it. Our law provides for us to go overseas and select refugees, process them nicely, and then bring them here, right? That's still the way our refugee law works. So what that means is that every year since 1980 and until now, people who arrive at our borders seeking asylum have the option of requesting asylum, which is this little kind of loophole category in the 1980 Act, which envisioned that there might be a few people every year that might already be in the US that might need to ask for asylum. But the number of asylum visas has historically been, extremely low. We're talking like a number of thousands that are available. We just didn't create a law that envisioned the likelihood, the very real likelihood of refugee flows from below our southern border, right? Of course, we've had them. We've had 4 decades of such flows, and we don't have a legislative solution for it, right? So what this means is that all of the kids who show up at the border are then classified as something other than unaccompanied refugee minors. They are designated unauthorized alien children. And we now have, as a result, a 2-tier system where we have a small number of unaccompanied refugee minors selected from overseas who are cared for quite well. And then we have hundreds of thousands of children who are designated unauthorized alien children who come to the border and are treated entirely different.
Wow.
Those are the children that most of us are familiar with and that the media is going in circles with, right? They exist in a different legal space. But the reality is the problem with our refugee law that doesn't account for their arrival has created the crisis that we're in, right? I will stop there.
Yes. No, that was incredibly lucid, and thank you for boiling that down so clearly. Now, in our Q&A from the audience, we have this is actually a huge question. How do we define a child? Kirk Davis asks. Jewish folks say today, "I'm a man," as part of their 13-year-old bar mitzvah ceremony. What is the I know that the definition of a child itself is something that is often in flux.
Yeah, I guess my answer to that would be we don't. Right? And part of the problem is that we do. So historians of childhood studies folks will tell you that one of the big questions that we is decide who's a child, right? Because childhood is a social construction in the same way that gender or race is a social construction, right? And it varies from historical moment to historical moment. It varies from place to time, right? Who is a child in our US Latinx communities might vary from who is considered a child amongst socioeconomically elite white Americans, right? It certainly varies from rural Central America to urban Mexico City or Buenos Aires to small town Southern California. What we see in this book is that the ideas of who is a child shift over time. And so as that shifts, certain groups of people that we now understand as children have been admitted or have slipped through the cracks because they've either been seen as children or not seen as children, right? And race has a lot to do with that. Historically, we've been much more willing to see British teenagers as children than Jewish adolescent boys, right?
Wow, of course. Well, that segues a little bit into the next question, which is from Jessica Lopez Espino. Did you see any patterns with respect to sympathy for children in terms of policies and practices along the lines of economic migrants versus refugee status related to war across time?
Oh, Lord. Hi, Jessica. I don't even know how to approach that. It's such a massive question. And so you and I can talk about that another day, but I would say that in terms of patterns, that patterns of sympathy are raced in US history. They're also very much tied to religion. We tend not to think of religion as being such a salient category now, unless we're talking about the Christian-Muslim divide, right? But historically, religion as an organizing category of identity was extremely salient for Americans, right? And so Jewish children versus Christian children and Catholic children versus Protestant children, these identity markers played a big role in who was seen as sympathetic. And yes, and race, very much so. Sympathy was definitely at its most effervescent when we were talking about white British children or white Hungarian children versus other brown or black or non-white children.
Anna Facio asks, wasn't Operation Peter Pan organized in part by the Catholic Church?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yes, in fact, the Catholic Church actually gets involved in like resettling refugees a little later than Jewish and Protestant denominations who were very active in the 1930s. The Quakers in particular, extremely active, probably the religious organization that gets the A+ in terms of effectiveness and motives. The Catholic Church really gets involved in resettling refugees sort of in the late World War II period. But as the Cold War begins, the Catholic Church becomes the primary resettler of anti-communist refugees.
Well, good. Now we have time actually for my question that I wanted to ask you earlier, which was, I was just, you have this passage where you summarize all the sources you went through, going through the archives of, government agencies, private organizations, even presidential libraries. So did you have like this aha moment where, imagine you as this investigator in this pile of documents where you saw a document that just really startled you or just was really dramatic, for you to find?
Yeah, I guess the aha moment that I had was when I found the documents that would allow me to write this book. Because I spent 5 years trying to trace these children through various archives across the country. There is no sort of central archive of migrant children, right? Even our Immigration Bureau, followed by the INS, followed by DHS, their archives are, and some would say deliberately, decentralized and very hard to find, right? And people also didn't track children or unaccompanied children consistently. They still don't in a lot of ways. So I knew, for example, I knew that Hungarian unaccompanied minors had come to the US, but I couldn't find them in any archive anywhere, right? So I spent a solid 2 years, probably my second and third year of this project, where I had good archival sources on later waves of children, and some archives, thanks to Jewish American organizations that have archived some of the materials on the German Jewish Children's Aid, as well as some scholarship done by some Israeli and Jewish American scholars. But the kids in the middle, right? The post-war kids, the displaced persons children, the Hungarian kids, I couldn't find them. I spent 2 years looking for them and increasingly thought, I'm panicking here because I've got to finish a book so that I can go up for full professor, and I've set myself this book project and I can't find the kids. I spent 2 years just going through presidential archives thinking, okay, like Eisenhower was president at this time. I'm going to read all of his meetings with State Department folks related to immigration and we'll find these kids. Couldn't find the Hungarian kids. Eventually I found a little reference to a organization called the International Social Services. I found a reference to them in a Catholic Church welfare archive in New York City. And then I traced this International Social Services organization, who it turned out had an archive at the University of Minnesota. And I went to visit their social welfare archives and found, finally, after these 2 years, found just a gold mine, not just of materials on the Hungarian children, but on all of the work that International Social Services had done with unaccompanied minors in previous generations that provided a counterpoint to all of the other materials that I'd read and helped me to actually see that the story was much more complicated and nuanced than my earlier archival sources had suggested. So if you're an archival researcher and you're struggling, have faith. push on. The truth is out there, right? As the
Mhm.
X-Files always said.
And those of us who are not archival historians are grateful for the incredible labor that you've done in finding these children and also in telling the stories with so much care to the differences among these different cases and the kind of convergence of all these different factors that make the stories of these different migrations distinct, even while you're also finding patterns there. It's really very illuminating. I want to thank Hector too for just being so prepared and so charming and just always so great. And our audience for we have questions here that we weren't able to answer that came in right at the end. We want to thank everybody who posed questions. And we will be continuing this series on refugee scholarship with an event on February 1st and then on March 1st. So I will write to you about that separately in a follow-up email. So a big hand for our two UCI authors and their contributions to our enlightenment, our conversation, and our knowledge. So thank you so much.